I'm thrilled to introduce our next guest. Hanna Rosin is an American journalist and author. She's senior editor at The Atlantic, and she was founder and is now editor of Double X, which is Slate's women's section. Her latest book is the best-selling The End of Men and the Rise of Women. Please welcome the very dangerous Hanna Rosin.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to begin by saying that I really love Melbourne. And I'm not just saying that to curry favor, especially with the men in the audience. It's just really my kind of city. I just have had a great time today. So I'd like to especially thank the men for coming, for obvious reasons. Maybe I should give you some comfort by saying that I've been talking about this book for the good part of a year, and my husband does not hate me. So that's something. Or at least he only hates me for the usual reasons, which is, how I load the dishwasher and that I disappear to Australia and leave him in charge of our 3 children for a week. And to the women in the audience, I will just condemn you for being deliberately barren, a term that I have really not heard except in the Bible and in Australian political culture. Really, honestly, who uses the word barren anymore? Okay, let's begin. So I want to start with some research that actually I did not include in the book. As part of my research, I interviewed thousands of what are called the alpha wife. Now, what's the alpha wife? It's a very simple concept. It means someone in a couple where the woman makes more money than the man. Now, in the 70s, this was an incredibly rare phenomenon. It was something like 4% of couples, and now it's up in the 40% in America, and that doesn't even count women who are single heads of households. So it really is quite a new dynamic, and it causes all sorts of turmoil. It's not necessarily bad, but as you can imagine, men have very mixed emotions about it, which ranges from pride to resentment to emasculation to delight. There's all sorts of ways that men can react. So we will begin with a couple, Andrea and Bill. Now, the reason I chose them to pull out of the thousands of couple is because their situation is particularly painful because they both started out at the same company at the exact same time, and then after a couple of years, Andrea ended up making about $8,000 more than Bill, which is not a lot, but it's enough to make Bill uncomfortable. So I'm going to read to you what Bill says about this situation. My wife, Andrea, and I both started at the same IT company straight from college, and after a few years, she overtook me professionally. I sat around thinking maybe she had better opportunities or some great breaks, but the reality is she worked harder, she was more organized, and she made better use of her time. There's nothing to ascribe it to except she's better than me. The most painful moment was when we were at a party and one guy turned to us and said, "You guys are doing great. Andrea, you're a vice president, and Bill, well, we don't really know what you are." I laughed along with everyone else, but 8 years later, I can still remember that moment very clearly. I was like, wow, I'm the naked emperor here. Ultimately, it's not that I wish she was less successful, it's that I wished I was less unsuccessful. It's a guy thing. It sucks to be beaten up by a woman. So there you go. You can read in Bill's voice all sorts of emotions. He's proud of his wife, but on the other hand, he feels like there's something not quite right about the situation, and he's embarrassed. And I think that kind of encapsulates the moment we're in. This isn't like a yay, women won and we triumphed. It's just kind of new and revolutionary, and I think it takes a lot of getting used to. I first started out in 2009 thinking about this in terms of economic changes, the recession, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then ultimately I became much more interested in how this was affecting people in their actual lives, relationships, how men and women viewed each other at different stages in life, how they made decisions about love and marriage and raising their children. And I think ultimately how people react depends very much on who they are and where they live. So now let's talk about the woman in the relationship. I got such varied reactions from the women that I'm going to read you 2 different kinds of women. We'll start with the resentful woman. Since earning my law degree in 1989, I have felt hunted like a deer by men as a desirable wife because of my wage-earning capability and my good job. I'll never forget my good friend's husband announcing at their wedding reception, "Now that I've married a lawyer, I won't have to work anymore." And he didn't. So that's the unhappy woman. But there's also delighted women, so I'll read you one of those. "I'm the one who's career-oriented. I don't want to come home to someone I have to compete with. Let's see who can climb to the top of the career ladder, who can make the most money. I was so sick of it. I wanted someone who didn't want to talk about their job all day, but who would rather go for a bike ride on the beach. So his making less money was kind of a plus for me." So like I've said, it's not necessarily that this is good or bad, it's just kind of new and confusing. And so I don't know how sort of geographically familiar you are with the US, but I'll try it anyway. So I did some of my research in the Deep South in Alabama, where their manufacturing crisis has hit really hard, and you have situations where women firmly believe that the man is the head of the household. Nonetheless, they are the ones who are providing the only steady paycheck. So they have to sort of delicately work around the man's feelings and try not to make him feel bad. And then the other day I got a letter from someone who said to me, "I don't know why you're making such a big deal about this. I'm a stay-at-home dad. Everyone applauds. It's really cool." And I looked at his sign-off, and he was from Portland, Oregon. So for any of you who watch Portlandia, it's like, okay, maybe in Portland, Oregon, everyone thinks you're cool, but it doesn't work that way in the rest of the country. Okay, let's see how we got to where we are. So 2009, when I start the research, here are some of the headlines from the newspapers. We called it the Great Man Session, the He Session. You can see in the last clip why that is, because the vast majority of jobs that were lost were men's jobs. And this was really just the final blow. In the most recent American Labor Department statistics, men have the lowest labor force participation rate that they've ever had. So in 1950s, let's say 1 in every 5 men was not in the labor force. Now it's, 1 in every 20 men were not in the labor force, and now it's 1 in every 5 men who are not in the labor force. And so economists talk about this as the sort of biggest social crisis that we're about to face. Now, what's happening to women in 2009? The exact opposite, basically. You have the end of the manufacturing economy being replaced by a service and technology economy in which men have no particular advantage. It's no longer about strength, and so women begin to take over in all sorts of ways. This last statistic is really interesting. Someone spread out the census map of America. He was a market researcher. He spread it out into the 2,000 regions of America, and what he found was in 1,997 of those regions, young childless women had a higher median income than young men, which is pretty remarkable because even though, that changes later when people have children and they run into the glass ceiling and all that, the idea that when people are making marriage decisions, women are likely to be making more money is really pretty revolutionary in terms of how people see each other. So what's behind the shift for women? I like to think of it, the term that I started to talk about is the traveling sisterhood in the economy, which is to say that as more women enter the economy at the top, as like lawyers, accountants, pharmacists, they open up jobs at the bottom for the kinds of things that wives used to do for free. So these are like low-paying jobs in childcare, elder care, food preparation, all the things that a wife would do. So it becomes a cycle where the more women come, the more women there are. Now, the most important thing is college education. This is, Australia has basically the same statistics as America. For every 3 degrees that women earn, men earn 2. Men, for some reason, just haven't changed their college degree rate in a long, long time as women continue to amass more degrees. So I'm going to turn to the world famous education expert, who is my daughter. Here is her theory about why it is that women do better than men in school. Oops. Oop. Like if a man were operating this video, it would work, but since it's me.
The girls are obviously smarter. I mean, they have much larger vocabulary. They learn much faster. They are more controlled. On the board today for losing recess, tomorrow, only boys.
And why is that?
Showing they were just not listening to the class while the girls sat there very nicely and did that.
you know, as it happens, she's largely wrong. It's not because girls are smarter than boys. We do have this boy crisis in education, which begins at the very young ages. You see darling, cute Jacob there. Probably the teachers or principals in his school call me every other day. I'm sure I have 12 messages on my phone right now from his teachers. Now, he is just as smart as my daughter, but there's a way in which boys think of school as a system that's rigged against them. You know, it's not about intelligence. It's something about discipline or being able to sit still, or, you know, expectations that we put on boys long before they're developmentally ready. But the lag starts very, very early in school, and boys just never catch up when you get all the way to college. So the whole thesis really came home to me when I went to visit a college in Kansas City. Now, when I was in college, I had the kind of equality feminist ideas, namely that, you know, I would work and my husband would work and we would both raise the children and it would be 50-50. I mean, I'm not saying it worked out that way, but it's just how I thought of it. And then I went to this college and the girls talked about their fiancés and boyfriends. And mind you, I purposely did not go to the Women's Study Center. I, in fact, sought out sorority girls. I don't know if you know what that is, but like cheerleaders, you know, those kind of girls. So I deliberately sought out those kind of girls. And the way they talked about the guys was like, oh my God, I have to drag him to the career center. He doesn't know what his major is. You know, he doesn't know what he's doing in life. It's like they talked about them like they were children. And here is a quote from a college girl, you know, a sort of working class sorority girl, not my quote, her quote, men are the new ball and chain. I was kind of shocked when I wrote it down. I was like, could you give me a better quote, girl? Thank you. So I'm just going to get a little bit meaner before I get nicer. I'll turn it around, I promise. So, you know, Australians will probably identify with this. This is the image of American manhood, you know, rugged in the outback. I'm sure you have a version of it, tough, in control of his own environment. A couple of years ago, he was retired and replaced by this much less impressive specimen. And the thing about him, besides being ridiculous, is that, you know, it's like it makes you realize that the tough man is always in quotation marks now. It's like we can't settle around the tough man. It's just a sort of awkward place to be, the manly man. And you laugh, but the phrase firstborn son, which has been so ingrained in our culture, one of the things I did was try and check if that concept was still alive and true. And so in the U.S., when you have a new fertility technique, you have to report your results to our governing body. And so there are very exact statistics about what people request. And so I went to the fertility clinics, and what I found was that couples were requesting girls 75% of the time over boys, which is pretty shocking when you think about, you know, sons and daughters and how they've been throughout history. And then one of my favorite statistics in the book, one of my chapters takes place in South Korea. South Korea has always been and remains one of the most patriarchal places in the world. Nonetheless, there's been this incredibly rapid rise of women through the education system and into the beginnings of the workforce and up to the management level. And one thing that's happened, because South Korea also keeps excellent statistics, is that the firstborn son preference has reversed itself in the last 2 years. And so couples, when they are asked by the South Korean government, what do you want your first child to be, more say girls than boys. So what's driving women forward? Here's a concept that I came up with. Lady superheroes, plastic woman and cardboard man. You know, again, trying to define the essential difference. I'm not one of those people who believes, you know, that the woman's brain is like this and the men's. I'm not like a biological essentialist. So I wish I were, because it would be much easier for me to make this argument. And it's not, as I said, that women are smarter. I think what's going on is that women are, at least this is what economists tell me, more flexible and adaptable to the rapid changes in the environment. So you can see this in community colleges, places where you get specific skills. It's like because women have been the underdogs for so long, they have a certain hustle quality where they can sort of adapt and fit into the cracks. It's almost like the business concept of disruptive technology. So maybe you can think of women as like the Apple computers of the economy, where they sort of start out behind and then somehow whatever qualities they have, the economy plays to those natural strengths. So it's an adaptability. There's one historian in the U.S. who disagrees with 98% of what I say, but the one place where we agree is that this concept of the masculine mystique, I'm sure you're all familiar with the feminine mystique from 1962, Betty Friedan's book. The concept of the feminine mystique was that we had defined femininity in such a narrow way that we put woman in a little box that she couldn't get out of. And now we kind of have this masculine mystique problem where we've defined manhood in such a way that it's preventing certain men from sort of getting the skills they need and being successful. So I would ask the guys in Alabama who were very smart and had a lot of skills and had been managers at factories making $100,000 a year, in these small towns where the only jobs are healthcare and government jobs, why don't you become a teacher? Or, why don't you go work in the hospital? And they would say, because that's a woman's job and I can't do that. So that's part of the problem. Okay, now we're going to talk about sex. I am not as good as Dan Savage on this subject, but, we'll do like the R-rated. If he's like the X-rated version, I'll just aim for maybe PG, actually. So we have all these changes. How do they affect people? So I want to go through the stages of life. Here is the first stage, the post-college hookup culture, as we call it. In the U.S., I think we're more prudish than you are. So this is not necessarily. We wouldn't use the words deliberately barren. So we have some things over you, but we are sort of bigger prudes than most people in the world. So there's a tremendous amount of hand-wringing about what's known as the hookup culture, which I can't actually see people in the audience, so I can't tell how old you are, but I will define it. In college campuses, I don't actually have to define what the hookup culture is, but it's this idea of intimate relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean sex without any kind of commitment, or certainly not a long-term commitment. So in the U.S., people always worry about this. They worry about women in this culture, that sort of women are getting screwed. This is a culture. Oh, I never said that before. That's the wrong thing to say. That women are discriminated against. Help me with a more proper term. Anyway, that this is a culture, this is a sort of sexual culture created by men for men in which women are the losers. How about that? That's better. That's appropriate. And, if you go to college campuses, I read all the books about the hookup culture. Researchers go around, they ask the women, what's the dating scene like? And the women will say, oh, the men here suck, they never commit, nobody wants to be your boyfriend. So you kind of hear that across the board. And something didn't strike me as quite right about that. So finally, I came across the absolute best study ever done about the hookup culture, in which... Now think about this, for those of you in the audience who are my age, because the researchers were about my age. So these sort of 40-year-old researchers camped out in a college party dorm for 4 years. Now, there's that Drew Barrymore movie where she goes back to college and does that, but I think she's like, 28. She's not 40, so that's a big difference. Now, why did they do that? Because they actually wanted to get a better sense of how women were interacting with the hookup culture. And yes, they picked up all of those, oh, men suck, they don't commit. They picked up some of that stuff. But what else they picked up was that in the long term, women were actually avoiding getting into long-term commitments, that at that stage of their life, they would say things like, I really can't be in a relationship right now because that's the equivalent of like a 6-credit class and I just don't have time for that. They had this very utilitarian notion that at that phase in their lives, they sort of wanted to get ahead, right? Like, how is it that women have a higher median income? Is because, before you've run into children or anything else, you're sort of thinking, well, where can my internship be? And, you have a sense of yourself as being very ambitious. And so in this generation, like what in the 19th century, the source of shame would be, getting pregnant. In this generation, the source of shame is, getting married too young, basically. That was a sign that you weren't sufficiently ambitious or looking out for yourself. So I wrote this theory in my magazine when my book came out, and I got tons of letters from young women. And what they said to me was, Hannah, you got this kind of half right. You're right that there's something we're getting out of the hookup culture and we kind of need it to be the way it is. But you didn't explain what these relationships are actually like that we're after. And I was very pleased to get these letters because, even though I sound like I'm sort of all cool and down with it, I actually read these hookup books and want to lock my children in the bathroom for the rest of their lives. All of them, not just my daughter, all of them equally. So then when I got these letters, I actually felt much better about it because this is a description of a relationship that didn't really exist when I was in college, but that seems okay. And I'm going to read you one of these letters. We want a person to hook up with, but also to hang out with, but none of the stifling constraints and stodgy strictures of the old school boyfriend-girlfriend commitment. We don't want to be compelled by expectations to do each other's laundry or bring each other chicken soup when one of us is sick. We don't even want to see each other every day and watch a sappy movie on a Friday night and snuggle. This is, by the way, my whole life that she's insulting, but oh well. Yes, some of us want that, but not every night and not every weekend. We certainly don't want these relationships to be entered into with an expectation of long-term or to get in the way of other important things in our lives. We, both men and women, are putting ourselves first. Some might call that selfish. We call it smart and independent and secure. So there you have sort of a woman speaking about what it's like to be a woman sort of in relationships today, which really doesn't sound so bad. Okay, let's move on to the next phase of life, marriage. One of the most interesting discoveries I made was how the rise of women were affecting marriage patterns, not just in the US, but around the world. And basically what I discovered was that marriage was taking two opposite paths. Not different paths, but totally opposite paths depending on what social class you were in. So in the elite educated classes, there is something called the seesaw marriage taking place. What does that mean? We're back to 1962 again, where the woman is sort of sitting and putting the slip covers on. When I reread Betty Friedan, I realized I don't even know what a slip cover is. So maybe that's, sign of enlightenment. But the idea is that either the man or the woman theoretically could be the main breadwinner at any given moment. And so you can trade places. It's not so much 50-50. It could be 70-30, and then it could switch to 60-40. So, for example, the Obamas have a classic seesaw marriage. Actually, our vice president does too. When Barack Obama was teaching in law school, and when he was starting out his political career, Michelle Obama was a healthcare executive making a lot of money. And then, of course, he becomes president, so she's his supporter as first lady, and he's often saying on the stage, when I'm done being president, it's Michelle's turn again. And so it's idea in the couples that we can take turns, and that has produced among the elites the most stable, happy marriages, the lowest divorce rates, the lowest rates of single parenthood that we have seen in many, many decades. Among everybody else, the not college educated, you have the exact opposite trend. Divorce rates have stayed as high as they were in the 70s, but what's really changed is that people don't get married anymore. And in America, that's meaningful. Like in Europe, people don't get married just means like they're Danish and they live together for the rest of their lives. But, in America, when people don't live together, it means like they have nothing to do with each other. And the fathers are just not in the picture. And so the biggest change in American culture in the last 5 years demographically is the rise in single motherhood. So we have a sort of astronomical rise. Now, why is that happening? If I were a conservative, I would say because we are all immoral and we have forgotten about God and women are barren and whatever. But if I'm a normal person, I would say that essentially women are, deciding. I don't really know how to say this without being insulting. So okay. Here's the phrase that I heard often when I was reporting. I would ask women often, where's the dad? Like, why aren't you with him? And they would say some version of, he's just another mouth to feed. That's why I'm not with him. So this sense that sort of men have lost their place as kind of, they think, in working class families where the men are out of work, this sense that it's not helpful for them to have the man around. And so there's been this total decline, which is actually really, really sad, because what it means is that marriage, like everything else, is becoming a class luxury. You know, marriage is for the rich, non-marriage is for everyone else. Okay, so now I want to talk about where we are now. So we have all this turmoil happening. What's actually happening with women now? Because the first question I'm going to get is, why aren't there more female CEOs? I know that. I know that already. So, you know, women do a lot of things now. They're sort of lead TV anchors, college heads, bank presidents. There are a few female CEOs. You had a prime minister. Congratulations. We haven't had one yet. And we actually also scatologically savvy comedians, I realize. That's a new category that women didn't used to occupy that they now occupy quite gleefully. And also, we're radically transforming our notion of what a good leader is. So it used to be that a good leader was kind of top-down, hierarchical, patriarchal, took risks. Now we incorporate lots of feminine principles into the idea. People wouldn't call them feminine principles, but when you read leadership books today, they're about inspiring the team and being like a coach and kind of understanding your employees. And this essentially creates a space for women to become leaders. Now, so why aren't there more female CEOs? One reason is because women have, the changes I'm describing are extremely new. They've been going on for sort of 40 years or so, and for men, they've been going on for like 40,000 years. So it takes a little while before these things actually take hold. But there's another reason, which I actually like to call the twitch. We as a society, we're back to Barron again. We are uncomfortable with certain forms of female leadership. We remain uncomfortable with a kind of dominant, aggressive woman. I mean, the things that your current prime minister said about women in leadership, so enlightened, is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. You know, maybe there's a reason why women, yes, there's a reason. So I think it was Arianna Huffington who once said that for a man to be called mean, he has to be Richard Nixon, and for a woman to be called mean, she just has to put you on hold. So it just gives you a sense of, you know, the meanness. There was a phase in early 2000s in the U.S. where there were all these advice books. They were kind of the early version of Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. And the series was called Nice Girls Don't Get the Corner Office. And this was a period when we really pushed women to, like, you know, lean in, stand up for yourself, you know, talk really loudly, be really, you know, aggressive, you know, show your muscles. So here's a quote from those books. If you worry about offending others and back down too easily and otherwise insist on workplace displays of girlish behavior, then you are sabotaging your career. So that's what we said in the 2000s. Well, we pretty quickly realized that that was disastrous advice. Why was it disastrous advice? Because when women behave like this, they get penalized. So study after study done out of the Kennedy School in NYU, they do many, many versions where, say, they give a resume and they give two resumes and the only difference between them is one says Andrea at the top and one says James. Or they show two videos of people asking for a raise and one is by a female actor and one is by a male actor. And consistently what they show is that if they speak the same way, they think that the dude is really cool and, you know, you want to, there are two measures. Would you give him the raise and would you want to work with him? And so the guy is always judged, you know, cool, he would be a great colleague, I'd love to have him as a boss. Yes, I would absolutely give him a raise. And the woman is like, I mean, I don't have to say it. She's a bitch, right? That's what they say about the woman. Now, luckily, they don't actually say that. But, you know, they sort of don't give her the raise and they judge her as someone they don't want to work with. That's the clean version of what I just said. So luckily, right before I published my book, the same researchers who are famous for doing all this research about, you know, how we respond to female aggression went back at the question and basically said, well, what are we supposed to do, right? Like, we're at this moment where women are rising into management positions, but, you know, if we rise in a certain way, we get penalized. So how are we supposed to manage this situation? So they sort of field tested a bunch of scripts. And I'm going to read you the scripts, and you're going to vote on which one you think works. So this is a script of a woman asking for a raise. Okay? You ready? Here we go. Script number 1. I think I should be paid at the top of that range, and I would also like to be eligible for an end-of-the-year bonus. Number one. Number two, I hope it's okay to ask you about this. I'd feel terrible if I offended you in doing so. Number two. Number three, I don't know how typical it is for people at my level to negotiate, but I'm hopeful that you'll see my skill at negotiating as something important I bring to the job. Okay, who votes for number one? I think I should be paid at the top of the range, the straightforward one. Like 20%. Who votes to I'd feel terrible if I offended you in doing so? That's too easy. Who votes for number three? And Australians are so smart. Yes. Why is number three the answer? Because what they found was that, well, think of it like this. If you see a mom walk into a school and, march into the principal's office and say, my kid needs this certain teacher and you have to do this for my kid, that doesn't violate anybody's stereotypes about how women behave. Why? Because the woman is being aggressive on behalf of someone else. It's okay for women to be aggressive on behalf of someone else, just not just for themselves. I'm not saying like this is feminist or great or you should applaud this. I'm just telling you what the researchers found. In fact, they were very annoyed with the findings because they thought they were too anti-feminist. So if you say to an employer, I'm negotiating for myself just so I can show you that later I'm going to negotiate on behalf of the company, then that's okay. Because it shows that you're sort of bringing the company, it's not purely selfish. And that didn't seem to trigger the twitch. That didn't seem to make people nervous. I actually talked to I interviewed a lot of female CEOs. I interviewed Sheryl Sandberg, and Sheryl Sandberg said that is exactly what she does and what she advises all her employees to do, even though it's irritating. It's just a way for women to get what they want and avoid triggering these bad things. So you can all be annoyed about that advice later, like why is it that women have to walk this tightrope? I don't know. One day they won't. So let's talk about where we go after the end of men. So yes, we are working out as a culture. Yeah, because, I had this biologist when I was publicizing this book, and he was a male biologist who proposed that we literally didn't need men. Like we were at the point where we could just harvest their sperm. And I was like, now I'm going to be associated with this guy. Like we're going to be in paragraphs together. I do not think we should ship men to the moon and harvest their sperm. Why? Because, I like my husband, I have 2 sons, I have a dad, I'm a normal person. So, despite the title of my book, I am a nice person. So the things we're working out in the culture, how much can we handle a new aggressive kind of woman? We've talked about that. Pop culture is helping us with these things. We've had a lot of roles that were once reserved for men, now given over to women. For example, Salt, the Angelina Jolie, that role was originally written for a man and then given to her. Do you guys know of the Hunger Games here? Are you guys familiar with the Hunger Games? Good. So if you haven't read them, it's too bad. You should have read them by now. They've been out for a long time, so I'm going to spoil the ending for you. Here's Katniss Everdeen. She's a typical male hero in so many ways. She is the aggressor. She's the killer. She's the provider for her family. She's deeply unpleasant, is not nice to anyone. And that's a thing sort of normally reserved for men, whereas the guy that she ends up with, this is a spoiler, she ends up with PETA. So the guy that she ends up with, it has all the traditionally feminine characteristics. That is, he's a baker. He's a romantic. He's the one who smooths everything over and negotiates with everything and makes, smiles and makes things okay. And ultimately the cool thing about this situation is I notice all these things, but it's not as if my daughter who reads these books comes to me and says, oh, Mom, they're doing such cool gender scrambling with it. She doesn't notice at all. For her, it's completely normal that, Katniss should be holding a bow and arrow and PETA should be what he is. So that shows that we are sort of acculturating ourselves to these new things. And just so you think it's not just for young women, there's hope even for us older women in terms of aggression. So that's what it is for women, and I think for men, we have a different situation, which is how much can we handle a more domesticated man? One of the things I did actually after I finished the book was look at the history of the American sitcom, and what you find in the American sitcom from the 1950s on is the recurring archetype of the idiot father. So Homer Simpson is a perfect example, right? Anytime you put a father in a domestic situation, he's a moron. Like, he blows up the toaster, he gives his children really terrible advice. Why is that? It's not like pop culture has a political agenda, but it's because we're uncomfortable making the man competent in the domestic situation. So if you put him there, you have to clearly transmit that that's not his place. That's really like feminist studies of me, but I actually think that's true. So now, for the last 2 years, actually it's less than that, it's only been a year, we have had for the first time in dozens of American shows the competent father. There's a lot of shows called Guys with Kids, What to Expect When You're Expecting has like Chris Rock and his Cool Dads group. You know, seeing a guy with a baby Bjorn, or this image here, is a fairly radical image in the American sitcom. Again, there's no political agenda here. I just think there's like a slow acculturation to the fact that it's not so terrible to think of men as slightly more domesticated. And the bottom line here is that he's domesticated and not emasculated. Like, he's still really sexy to his wife, and he's remained so. So I think that's what's cool about the way these new shows operate. And I will say I had an early screener of this particular show because the show is based on my End of Men piece. That's where the idea came from. So they sent me a screener. And in the early versions, he was a typical idiot dad. He was like playing a video game at home, and the baby was like falling off the couch, and he didn't even really notice. And the diaper was, that's like the typical dad. And as the show went on, they kind of got more comfortable with the idea that he didn't need to be that way. And so they've turned him into a kind of, sexy authority figure at home. So these things are important, and getting mainstream, not just the enlightened liberal men to think it's okay to own your fatherhood. So what actually do I want after the End of Men? I haven't really answered that question yet. So here I will answer it now before I end. I want for both boys and girls, men and women, to be able to choose across, if you think of there being a menu of traditional gender traits, so the traditionally gender traits for men are kind of dominant, aggressive, risk-taking, and the traditional traits for women are nurturing, helpful, whatever. You want to be able to choose across the menu and not pay such a high penalty. So if my daughter should turn out to be one of these, kind of aggro, ball-busting, whatever, lean-in types, then she shouldn't be penalized for that, It's not to say every woman has to be like that, but probably a slightly larger percentage of women would like to be like that than is socially acceptable. And the same is true for men. So for example, if someone were to see my son, that dear son who you saw on the screen, he's a kid who like marches to his own drummer. I can't imagine him holding down a 9-to-5. And so one day when he gets married, and hopefully he'll marry a woman who makes more money than he does, because he'll need her to take care of him. But when he marries that woman, and he decides he's only going to work 4 days a week, let's say, and then they have a kid, and so on Tuesday afternoon, he's doing some crazy like rocket building project, Tuesday at 3:30 with his child on the playground, that any one of us who passes him on the playground at 3:30 on a Tuesday should not have the thought, what's wrong with that guy? Does that guy not have a job? Like, what a loser. We should not even notice him. We should just like walk on by the playground, and it should be perfectly fine. So, you can think of it as the end of male entitlement, or the end of one kind of man and the beginning of another kind of man. So that's the hopeful ending to this story. And that's all. Thank you so much.
I'm still reeling from the idea that the Old Spice man is risible as a figure. I thought it was.
You thought he was your role model?
Yeah, I've gotten something tragically wrong.
Well, you have the pecs, at least.
Well, yeah, I work for that. There will be don't laugh that hard, please. There will be microphones at either side. Please make your way there with your questions. I'm curious, in the realms of dangerous ideas, there's always something a bit dangerous about heralding the end of something.
Yes.
Because the idea of talking about the end of something suggests that the need for a struggle might be over. And one of the heartening things over the past few years in Australia, in a context where I personally feel we've seen some pretty distressing things about our own attitudes to gender, has been the emergence of a new generation of feminists. And I genuinely believe that it's young and new feminists who are doing extraordinary and wonderful things, and they believe there's a struggle.
Do they identify as feminists? Because young American women definitely do not.
I think, and I'm open to contradiction here from people on the floor, but I think they do more at the moment than they might have, say, 10 years ago. But what would you say to those young feminists if patriarchy's ended, if we've turned it around, where's the struggle? Why is there...
Oh, there's lots of places where the struggle is. I mean, the end of men really has, there are millions of problems to be solved. It's more like there's been a cultural shift in this old idea that the man is the breadwinner. It's like the end of the male privilege would be a sort of more accurate but less interesting title. All sorts of things like, well, there's two... I've become more radical as I've talked about this book in some ways. Wage gap struggles, the struggles at the top. If there are parts of America like the working class and the middle class where I go there and I think this is a world turned upside down. Like the most conservative places in America are living a kind of upside down gender dynamic, but it's not true at the top. There's certain industries where women have a long way before they break in, like finance, for example. So what do I mean by I've become more radical? I've become second wave in a way that I didn't used to be, because I used to have the lean in idea, that women should just sort of work more to close the wage gap because part of the wage gap is due to women working fewer hours. But now I think it's why this is a sort of system created by men, and maybe we don't want to work that way. Maybe it's time for women to accept that for example, finance. When you poll women about what motivates them at work, you almost never find money at the top of that. And so you find, I want meaning in my work, I want to make a difference, I want satisfaction, I want to be personally satisfied. Women have many ways to express this. But we have to own that. We have to really grapple with that idea, because it is a problem that the top 1% of rich people are all men. And yet, what are you going to do if women don't want to work in the same way that men do? It's like you have to find an alternative way to power. I haven't fully worked this out. It's kind of the opposite of what I say in my book, sorry. But I will work it out eventually.
I like we're seeing a sequel being written while you're on stage, contradicting yourself.
Yes,
that's a good thing. We're going to start over this side with a question.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was really great. If we are coming to the end of men or the end of male entitlement, should we not expect that there would be an equivalent reduction in rates of sexual assault that are overwhelmingly committed by men against women?
Two opposite things going on with sexual assault, and forgive me, I don't know the Australian numbers, and feminists really get enraged when I say this, although these are just like FBI White House numbers. Assault has gone drastically down in the last 15 years. And the reason for that, the rates, if you say how many women have been, X number per X number of women have been victimized. Why has it gone down? Because women are less economically dependent on men. So women are not, anymore stuck in relationships where they're being abused because they control the housing. Now, at the same time, you have the rise, it's a minority, but you have the rise of extremely violent rage by men out of work against women who blame women entirely for their problems. So there's a new book called Angry White Men, in which the misogyny and the way men talk just makes you want to weep, So there is this minority now that really hates women, beginning with their ex-wife and on to all of the female race. So it's like you've got a backlash, but statistically you've got a decline.
Over this side.
Hannah, in terms of the trends that you're talking about and writing about with women entering the workforce, What implications do you see, or what correlations do you see between those trends and rates of childbirth? And what potential society-wide implications are there from those correlations?
You know, I was shocked to learn that the Australian age of first marriage is 30. That's really, really old. No, I mean, it goes up everywhere in the world, but 30 is the oldest I've come across. I feel that women much younger than me, so not women in their 30s, but women in their 20s, are now fully aware. I'm not sure that they'll do anything about it, but are fully aware of, the difficulties of getting pregnant at age 40 or whatever, of thinking of yourself as completely sort of first the career and then the children. I'm not sure how they get out of this bind, but I think they're at least not blind to it. I would love if a young woman would speak to that question of how people are thinking these days about, when you have children versus when your career. Because actually conservatives worry about this a lot, the decline in childbirth rates. We have now, the US is for the first time declining. Europe has been declining for a really long time. Now, I've always been jealous of European declining birth rates because I feel like that's like a gun you can hold to the government's head to give you better maternity leave and various policies. It's like, treat us better, we'll have more children. So I've been waiting for the American birth rate to decline so that we don't have any maternity leave, which is so pathetic. Anyway, go ahead.
You sort of mentioned earlier about the difference in pay, the pay gap, the gender pay gap, but you seem to imply that it was mainly because women are working fewer hours.
Okay. But go ahead, yeah.
No, that was mainly my question about how does that match up with what you're talking about in your book, the rise of women and...
So it's... A lot of it, women's income has been rising while men's income has been steadily declining. So let's say, let me explain it this way. Take a job like a copy editor, right? So let's say you have 10 copy editors. 8 of them are women. 2 of them are men, so there are more women more women working than men, but the man could still be paid more. There's an aggregate more number of women working, but there could still be a wage gap between the man and the woman. Now, in terms of what causes the wage gap, some percentage of it is because women work fewer hours. And again, that you have to just get deeper into why do women work fewer hours? Why is it that the caretaking responsibilities fall on the women? So that's not a final answer, but it is true that women work fewer hours. Some of it is due to different work choices, so the choices that women make out of school. So the real wage gap, 70 cents on the dollar is not really the real wage gap. It's more like 89 cents on the dollar, which is, there when you ask what feminists have to fight for, you still have a 10% difference for no reason, except discrimination.
Hello, thank you for speaking this afternoon. Firstly, I would identify as one of our new generation of feminists, so that answers that question. If you were speaking to all the men and the women of Melbourne and Australia, following our last tumultuous few years of gender in politics, what would you say to the generation about the way forward from having our first female Prime Minister and then the backlash and the talks of misogyny and the just the tumultuous nature of her time as our Prime Minister?
The no longer having a female Prime Minister.
She gave the best possible speech about this that I've ever heard anyone give about misogyny. I mean, it was really quite amazing. And I guess I took heart in the fact that she had a platform to give that speech and to make it seem like the kinds of things that your current Prime Minister said about female leadership were totally retrograde and unacceptable. So yes, she is no longer the Prime Minister, but at least she has a platform to push that issue along so that slowly the culture comes to understand that it's just like this business about male and female leadership is just bullshit. Like it isn't true that men are naturally made to be leaders and women are not made to be leaders. So, I mean, that, it seems to, our struggle is nobody would ever say something like that out loud, I think, in our country. It would be more subterranean. Our struggle is about legislation and family leave, and maybe your struggle is cultural. It's like what's culturally acceptable and what's not to say.
Hi. I was just wondering...
Hello.
Yes, hello.
You can say hello.
I was just wondering, obviously the situation in the South is unsustainable in terms of eventually men will have to start working somewhere, and eventually they'll realize their narrative just doesn't work anymore. What do you see as the future there?
What was the second part? Eventually
the narrative they have right now of the man being really in charge and being the breadwinner, they'll realize eventually that's just not true.
Well, no, they've done something very, very interesting, which I actually kind of respect. So when I was down in Alabama, I would keep saying, I would be like the pushy, New Yorker and be like, but what do you mean he's the head of the household? Like if he's not working, how can he be the head of the household? Now it turned out that was a very narrow way of putting it. What they've done is so head of the household, it's a very strong biblical idea. So what they've done is redefine head of the household so that it has nothing to do with money, which I think is legitimate. So they'll say, he makes the final decisions or, something like that. But just because I bring home the paycheck doesn't mean he doesn't have the ultimate authority.
Will it stay that way eventually when the women have the economic power?
There's a good way it can go and a bad way. So this is very American, forgive me, but I purposely chose an all-white town in Alabama because we are familiar with the African American story. So essentially what happened in inner Detroit in the mid-70s is what's happening in Alabama in 2013, where in the mid-70s you had lots of intact black families and factories in the town, and then the men lost their jobs and never regained their place in the family. So basically the rates of sort of black male incarceration through the roof. David Simon will talk about these inequalities later tonight. So that's one way it could go. You could have this huge gap where the men never regain their place, white men, increasingly middle-class men. You could have that happen. So it could be just this massive disaster. Or you could have a more hopeful thing. Our political parties do talk a lot about, return to the manufacturing age, men finding their place, in the sitcoms, being more domesticated, staying with their families. So, right now I can't answer. I don't know which way it's going to go. It could be horrible or like great, new, enlightened man everywhere. So we'll hope for the latter.
Seems likely.
Hi. Okay, is it on? Hi.
Hi.
This is a question about, yes, there's been an increase of women in the workforce. There are feminised occupations which have got huge pay gaps in the sense that there's segmentation in the labour market. So, yes, women are growing in the workforce, yet the contest around pay is contest at higher levels. And it's contest about power in the workforce. So perhaps we are talking about very different scenarios where feminised occupations are segmented and will continue to be contested because they're low pay.
Right. So there's two ways of viewing this, and I'm not sure I'm right about this, but this is the debate we have in America all the time. There are certain sort of ghettoized feminine jobs. Like if you look at the list of the top growing jobs in America, the vast majority of them are in the healthcare industry, and women work in the healthcare industry. So there are lots of jobs for women to have, but there is this way in which just because women have the jobs are naturally devalued. Now, certain professions have gotten around that, like the pharmacist profession, which has become entirely female, but is a very valued profession. The other thing to think about is, are women choosing these, are they devalued because women are choosing them, or are women making legitimate choices to go into professions which they like and appreciate and which give them a certain kind of flexibility in their life, even though they're slightly lower paid? I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, some countries have managed to turn that around, like Finland and teachers, right? Like Finland has made teaching a phenomenally respected profession. So you can do it, but that's another work for feminists, is to sort of zero in on the professions that are devalued largely because they are female-dominated.
Amongst the responses to your work, some of the people who seem to be most challenged by this book are fellow feminists rather than... Why do you think that is?
Because at the top, because it's an obnoxious title and they don't feel like it's the end of men, and I think at the top it doesn't feel that way. Like if you're sort of if you're in the elite class, like you're very ambitious, and so the place you're aiming for is quite high, and at the very top it's still largely male, so it just doesn't feel true. The cultural shift is definitely true. I mean, you accept that a woman can be the breadwinner, all that stuff is true, but the stuff about like power and money at the very top, which is a tiny percentage of the population, but if you're an elite feminist, that's what you're looking at, and so it's annoying,
Why do you think it is I can't think of many other social movements where there's such an acute sense of generationalism in the way people self-identify, in civil rights, in other human rights movements. You don't talk about waves in the same way that you do in feminism. Do you think that's something inherent in the feminist struggle, or do you think...
Yeah, I think it's an advantage for women. So even when women fight, there's just kind of a sense of a sisterhood, and there's also a sense of a culture paying attention to kind of these large waves. And when I was talking about Plastic Woman and adaptability, if you look over the course of the century on almost every measure, from fashion to work habits to sort of sexual permissiveness, women have made huge changes in how they are in the public sphere, and men have made very few changes. And there's not... One of the difficulties for struggling men now is that there isn't a men's movement, and we can't even imagine a men's movement. I mean, in the U.S., we've been talking, for example, about the boy crisis in schools since 1990. I'm not the first person to talk about it, and yet we just can't fundamentally accept the idea that men might need help. Like, it is well known among college admission counselors that there is affirmative action for men. It's what everybody knows that you take a man and a woman of the same, but you're giving the man an advantage because men have lower grades. Totally taboo to speak about this out loud. And I think it's, there's just a resistance to the idea of men needing help or bonding together or anything like that outside of unions. Like, unions was the last moment when you had kind of men grouping together to fight for their own interests. So you start the men's movement. That's your job.
I'm busy. I can't have it all, Hannah. On that note, I'd ask you to join me in thanking Hanna Rosin.
Thank you.